The UK pension system relies on employers. It's one of the largest in the world. It's well regulated, well managed. Yet, there are crazy stats about workplace pensions. Like 3 million people lose or forget their pension accounts, or millions will not have contributed enough to retire, and they are heading into a crisis in a few years. Those are things that decades of education, communication, etc. have failed to solve. And those employers responsible for enrolling and contributing to pension can be as small as having just one employee. Really, they want to get on with their business instead. This episode is about how a dedicated technology for workplace pension can address those challenges to deliver better outcomes for employers via their employees. I'll be talking to Eve Read, a well-known figure in the retirement savings industry and a senior director at Smart. Enjoy the conversation.
I'm responsible for proposition, so product side, thinking about how we deliver the best for our customers, both members and employers. And I lead on strategy and also share the responsibility for policy with another colleague.
That's right. So that's a lot to explore, but let's jump straight into Smart Pension. So there's a clue in the title, but can you tell us more about the company?
Yeah, so we're, I guess, a tech-led pension company, so very much in that FinTech space. And we are digital first, but not digital only. So what we try to do is deliver things well to our customers through the use of our proprietary technology, which enhances the way that we do things for all of our customer groups.
Right. And when you say customer groups, you already mentioned that it's pensioners directly, but also there's a B2B side.
Yeah, so generally our customers are employers who will come to us either directly or through an intermediary. They are the ones that contract with us, but we take their members, their employees, they become our members. So they're really the end recipient of our services, whilst it's the employer that does the contracting with us and the selection of Smart Pension as their pension provider on behalf of their employees.
You mentioned this tech proposition. I don't know, it's at the core of what you do. Could you tell us about that as well?
So Keystone is our platform. The organisation has been developed over the last 10, 12 years, and Keystone has been core to that. We operate not just in the UK, but also in the Middle East and in the US as well. So our Keystone platform is the basis of how we do things at Smart. We have, obviously being a relatively new organisation compared to the rest of the large part of the pension industry, which has been around for decades and decades, we don't have the constraints of a legacy system, which allows us to be a little bit more nimble. We are able to be more efficient in the way that we deliver services to our customers, predominantly the members, but also on the employer side. So we have really good payroll connectivity, for example, using newer tech than probably a lot of other providers are able to do.
We discussed previously about core banking, which is kind of an ongoing issue in the banking sector. And people think, the core banking has been built 50 years ago or something like that, and people have built on top of that. Is that a good analogy for the pension sector?
Yeah, I think in places that does still exist. So if you think about, there's a huge amount of record keeping that has to take place in the pensions world. There's lots of complexity around that. And a lot of the administration systems are 30 to 40 years old, for example. And they were built for a defined benefit pension world. And now we're in a defined contribution pension world. The requirements of an admin system are quite different now as we move in the DC future than they were to look after benefits under a DB world, because this is a data that required to understand what the value of their pension is entirely different to now. Clearly technology evolves every single day of the week. So something that is new now is not going to be new in a few years' time. So being able to keep at that cutting edge is quite challenging, to have to keep reinvesting in platforms. We are lucky that because we own and manage our own platform, we're able to focus on areas of development that we think are important and bring value through to our customers, rather than being led by what a technology provider or partner chooses to develop into. But yes, you're right. There are constraints around the current system, and there's a lot of investment happening across the industry.
No, I get it. Yeah. Now we apply technology to, the things you mentioned, payroll, admin, etc. And pension funds were not built with technology in mind, right? One of the things that I'm always very interested to understand better is how does it look on the client side and what were they doing before, typically?
Yeah, I think that's the key question, isn't it? What they're doing before. Smart Pension is an organisation that came out of the government's desire to auto-enrol every single worker into a pension. So we were set up during a phase when lots of employers were having to create pension schemes or put their employees into a pension scheme for the first time ever. So a lot of those early customers would potentially never have had a pension before, but if they had, it was some time ago. They didn't have a pension with their current employer. So that's quite a different population to the ones we're taking on now, where they're predominantly, they have a pension already and they're choosing to move that into Smart Pension. We're choosing to move their employees into Smart Pension. So they might come from another master trust. They might come from what's called a single employer trust arrangement. So that's where the employer is managing the pension scheme themselves. And in moving to a master trust, they are choosing to give the responsibility for running that scheme and looking after the employees and members to that organisation, to that trustee board. So in terms of how it might look different from a customer perspective, if we think about employers first, if they're moving from a single employer trust environment, then actually there's a huge amount of governance and oversight that they don't need to do any longer. They don't need to make lots of decisions about how they structure things, whereas they're having to do that if they're running a single employer trust. They're also, we would hope, seeing more sophisticated payroll connectivity and ease of being able to manage huge numbers of members. I mean, one of our sweet spots is that because of our automation on the platform side, we can manage very efficiently flows and ebbs and flows of members, employees coming in and out of the workforce. So ones that have got transient workforce or lots of turnover are, an area where we can really do a good job that we would expect an employer to see a different experience with us. When it comes to a member, again, we're being tech-led. We have an app which has been around for some time. We're just about to launch a new version of that. Some providers are only just launching apps now. So the ability to connect with us and have access to information and be able to make changes on the fly. We are very led by trying to offer a smooth member experience through online claims ability. So rather than having to phone a service centre in order to extract some money out of their pension or take their tax-free cash, we want very much to make that a smooth online experience, unless they need help with something, obviously, and then there's diversion into speaking to a human if that's what they would prefer to do. And then there are other areas that we think are important for members to understand. We will use the app and web environment to push through messages around those important aspects and decisions that we feel members should be making. So, for example, we launched a new version of our pension calculator. I think the first new version went live just before Christmas, but we've been pushing out various launches of this in a very agile, iterative manner. The first version was focused on increasing understanding about where you are from a pension saving perspective, converting that to an income so people can understand how they've got already might compare to what they are taking as income during their working life, and really making it easy to make changes within the app. So if they wanted to change their contribution rate, they can do that at the click of a button once they understand how that might look and how that might improve their future. And that's something that's different from what other providers' experiences look like.
No, sure. Now, the company point of view, obviously there's a requirement to provide a pension, but from what I understand now, it's not a core competency from a given company, right? They have to set up a pension, they have to manage it, they have to provide certain types of services. And those are all like things they have to do, but on top of that, it's kind of a benefit and has a strategic value, just like you may offer more salary or more pension, etc. So my understanding is that, yes, there could be all that going on through the company side, and therefore they would be opting to outsource it. Is that the right word?
That's effectively it, yeah. I mean, if you think of it like a company will need insurances, They are unlikely to try and self-insure, or that some companies do that. But actually, the normal approach is that you would speak to a specialist and you would outsource that work to them, and they would manage it, oversee. They would even advise you on, well, actually, your level of coverage should move up because your employee size has doubled. Those sorts of things. So it's a good analogy to other benefits, I think, and tasks that a corporate organisation has to implement. If you think about the auto-enrolment world, though, those big corporate organisations are very different from the ones that were required by government to implement pensions for their employees. So my husband, for example, runs a small business. He's only got 2 employees, but yet he has to offer a pension for them. He's even further from being a specialist in running some of these things. So even more important, there are providers like us where there's minimal interfaces needed, intervention required as a push across from payroll once that's run on a weekly or monthly basis, and everything flows through and happens. So there's little for the small business owner or medium or large owner to really be thinking about managing.
Right. And that brings me back to your earlier point of propositions and product. So how does it work for those, different types of companies? Is that the proposition that we're talking about?
Yeah, it is. So because of the nature of a master trust, the concept is that you've got multiple employers being serviced by the same trust. So we have a trustee board who oversee all those savings. They effectively look after the members and ensure that we're acting in the members' interest. And they're effectively passing down delivery of that pension scheme to Smart Pension. We deliver that on behalf of the trustee board. So there is a core proposition that runs across all of our customers. Now we think that once an employee group is in the scheme, whilst they're still associated with an employer, really we're thinking about them as individuals rather than employees of that.
Got it.
We do have, in terms of how we manage the relationships, we have key accounts, employers that we will get extra services. So we will deliver on-site presentations, for example, to their employees to educate them around the pension or even broader finances and things. So there are extra services that would be delivered to large accounts, large employer accounts. But on the surface, most of what we do, we deliver to everybody. And it doesn't matter whether you're employed by a hairdresser in a small town in Essex, or whether you are working for a large supermarket, you get the same service. There are a couple of scenarios that step outside of that. So we have a couple of sections within our master trust whereby we service other parts of the industry. It's probably not worth getting into because it'll probably get a bit confusing, but they have slightly differentiated propositions, but it's mostly facilitated by Keystone at that point.
Sure. Yes, let's try to keep it simple. I've had the previous conversation in pension, in particular with Alicia from the PLSA. There's like a big picture, and then there's 100 others. But I was also interested to understand from the end user point of view, so they know they're dealing with smart pension, or do they still feel like their employer's in the middle?
Yeah, we are the pension provider that their employer has chosen channels. Having said that, there is some functionality that we can alter on either an advisor basis, so some of those come through a distributor, or direct to some employers as well. So, and there is also functionality that even the smallest employer could choose to turn on if they want to. So, for example, we have like a welcome banner within our member app, which an employer can put text into, and they can choose to have a personalized message, something they want to guide their employees towards. So there are bits of functionality and format and colors and things that we can effectively alter. But the service underlying it all is pretty much the same.
If my business required that, we could go to Smart Pension, and then what the proposition would include, apps, different, let's say, interfaces, and then of course an investment proposition, a plan that goes with it. And although I signed up as an employer, but basically the business, this is something that becomes available to all the employees.
Correct.
Got it now. Okay. I think that gives a very good picture, but that's kind of a static picture, right? And it's a moving word. And you've published something about Pension 2030. And one of the things you mentioned is, for example, engagement, education. How are you involved in that aspect as well?
Yeah, and I have been in previous roles as well. So my role at Nest, I was the lead for customer engagement, for example. In my current role, yes, responsibility through the proposition, really, everything we do should be trying to engage and educate our members as well as deliver the best service we can. Now, what's interesting around engagement is I've been working in the sphere of DC pensions for 15 years now, I think. And the challenge has been, so if we think about the transition from DB pensions world to DC pensions world, is it worth going into that a little bit, just to talk about the difference between the two? In a DB pensions world, employers offered a pension. It was usually offered, managed by themselves, so very much in that kind of original model. And they made a promise to employees about how much pension they would get when they retired based upon a number of factors. One, how long they worked for them, and their salary. And so an employee would know, if I stay with this company 20 years and my salary at the end point is X, this is what I'm going to get. So it's very much a very known arena. There were no decisions needed to be made on the part of the individual, but the risk was all borne by the employer. And that is where it all started to unravel, because once investments weren't doing quite as well, it was harder to make the money grow as fast as they needed it to, and people were living for longer. That became very unsustainable. So we've moved into where we have DC pensions, which is where other parts of the world have been for a long time. So Australia in particular has got a 30 to 40 year history of DC pensions. And now the risk is borne by the individual. So they have to make active decisions about how much they choose to save, because the legislative minimums are not sufficient, really, unless you're on a very low income, to sustain you in retirement. And you have to potentially make decisions around where that money is invested, how much risk you want to take, what you're comfortable with when you think you might retire, because if you're 55 and actually you plan to retire in 2 years' time, your investment options should look very different from someone who plans to work for another 10 to 15 years. So all of these, and then when you get to the point of retirement, how you take that money, how you choose to use it, whether you move into an annuity product, which then gives you a certain income for all of retirement, or whether you choose to manage it yourself in a drawdown model, as they call it. So there's so many different decisions that individuals now have to make that they didn't need to 20 years ago. I wrote a blog about this called The Retirement Role Model Gap, because I do feel that people don't really understand at the moment anything about pensions. But one big issue with that is that they don't yet recognise that their retirement is going to be quite different to that of their parents or their grandparents, and that they need to be taking more active management of their position and preparing for retirement in a way that previous generations haven't needed. So that's quite a big challenge.
It makes me really consider where we are. And I think still the, let's say, mental models in terms of pension is to say, hey, accumulate, and chill. But obviously that's not the case. So there's this cultural shift. And on top of that, there are demographic shifts. We age differently, etc. One of the reference I had in mind is a 62-year-old, maybe 63 now, Tom Cruise, who's preparing for his stunt by, training to jump from a cliff. It's not our common pensioner, but it's one extreme case and one way to think about it in terms of pension. So the key from what you mentioned is people need to be educated, aware. Is that the work that needs to be done?
Yeah, and that takes us back to what your question, which is around the engagement and education. So I think, yes, people do need to be educated and engaged, but there is a challenge in that that's very, very difficult to achieve. So, I mean, you've referenced already, pensions is a very large topic area and it's very complex. And if your average person doesn't even understand interest rates or compound interest, then how are they going to understand the complexities of pensions? And we've been trying, I think, lots of us individually and as providers in the industry for probably close to 2 decades now to increase engagement levels up, because we've recognised that people need to more actively take control of their pensions. And whilst progress has been made, and I think there's been a huge amount of innovation and concepts and ideas, spark and work in places, we're not achieving the engagement levels probably above about 50%. And that means that 50% of the population saving into pensions are not actively engaging. Mm-hmm. So as providers, and the industry are thinking about this, how do we work around that lack of engagement or education or understanding so that we can offer pension products and services that work whether someone is fully engaged or not? Can we design default products? Do we know enough about our members to be able to make some proactive decisions on their behalf around where they're invested, for example? And we do already do those things through default funds, etc. But can we go further than that to make it more relevant to that individual without making it a risky endeavour for them? So I think it's there's a balance to be struck there, but I think we can go further than we have been going without moving into that risky area. In terms of education and also engagement to some degree as well, I think we are already doing, but we can do more in what I would call micro interventions. So if someone chooses to log on to their app, and maybe they only do it once a year, but what can we do in that intervention with them that could provide a little bit of education, could ask them 1 or 2 key questions that help us understand more about them, so that when we serve up the next thing, it's actually more relevant to them and helps them understand. But I think almost masking some of the complexities from most people, not everybody, but most people.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting angle, because indeed we talk a lot about financial education. First, not everyone wants to be spending their time on this. I am listener of this podcast. There are people who like to geek out on these things, but it's not the common public. I understand people may have better things to do, but this idea of engagement, nudging, etc. is very interesting. And on top of that, there's an awareness campaign, pay attention to your pension and the public videos, etc. But there's also being part of our digital life. So is this also what you're considering in terms of how the app is going to evolve and stuff like that?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think pensions is not the thing that most people wake up thinking about. It might be for me, but for most people it's not, right? So we have to make it easy for them to access the information they want when they want to see it in the places that they go to. If they're in their banking app and they're able to use open banking to bring through information on different saving products, that should include their pension, right? So they can track how that's doing alongside everything else. We don't actually want to create an army of people who are logging into their pension on a daily or weekly basis to see how it's moving up and down, because they'll get concerned about the volatility. I mean, I think we're all seeing, the effect of what's happening in the US at the moment on our investments. And actually, that does make you concerned. Even as a pension professional, you say, oh, gosh, it's gone down. That's annoying. We don't want people to take detrimental action off the back of that. So what we want is enough engagement. And also, I think the use of tools and things around it. So I mentioned that the pension calculator already. One of my big objectives for the iterations that we've pushed out and we continue to push out on the pensions calculator is that we give people certainty and understanding when they're saving enough as well, because what I don't want is for it to be a stress and them to be on a good path. We want them to understand that what they're doing now is great and they're facing the right direction. They don't need to worry about it. They can leave it alone. It's doing what it should be doing. So I think there's a dual benefit to some level of increased engagement and being able to give that security and a confirmation to people as and when they need it.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating and complex issue, because you can see how it's a bit of everything, right? Tech, education, finance, cultural shift, demographic shift, etc. And as you've published this document about Delivery 2030, I wanted to go back to just a few of the key points that I see here. It's a big document. We discussed about a lot of different things and not very tangible. But for example, here you'd have 5 key points we really need to have. Saving for retirement from the age of 18, saving consistently with a living pension, easy comparing pension, viewing all the things in one place, able to make key decisions without the need for complex advice guidance. So there's also some solid bases that we can work with, right?
Yeah, there are. I think there's some things we can do already. There are some things that really government intervention would at least move ahead more quickly. And there's some things actually we definitely need government intervention to help resolve. So the savings from younger ages, saving from the first pound of earnings, those things, and potentially increasing the contribution rate up as well. And I think there's relatively good consensus that all of those things are the right things to do. Industry is fairly uniform in their view on that. But there isn't quite the appetite at the moment for obvious reasons from a government perspective in order to force those changes through. What I would like to see and what we would like to see is a timetable set out. So even if we can't commit to those changes at the moment, and we understand why, that there is a timetable that is put out there that employers understand when these things will happen. Members, employees, if they are engaged, can see that information, and then as providers we can prepare for it. I mean, there's not much build work probably needed on our side, not many adjustments. There's probably moving a few parameters, but actually, the more time that we have to prepare for that, the better. Now, in the meantime, some employers already do all of those things. So they invite anybody to join the pension scheme. They will pay from the first pound, and they will pay at higher contribution rates. But they're generally people who work for larger employers who are just, it's part of the competitive resource model, the employment model. So those who work for smaller employers are not necessarily going to get that. And I do understand it from an employer side as well. Having a husband, as I mentioned, who runs a small business, there is an extra cost on top of the NI changes that are coming through or have come through. So it is a challenge to balance all of those demands. But the reality is that if we don't act, well, we're already too late. Okay, there is going to be a generation of people who will be retiring on DC pensions that are not large enough. And I think in a way, we have to go through that pain so that there's a recognition that people need to do things differently. But it would be good if, as an industry, we were able to say, yes, this is a problem, but we're already fixing it for the future.
Okay, I want to go back to the government role and other stuff, but also what you said, there is a problem. So what happened to those people? They will have to reduce their lifestyle, live cheaply,
work for longer. I think what's worried lots of us in the industry for a long time, I've got colleagues at my current organisation, but also at previous organisations who've given a lot of their time to thinking around this area. We have a particular issue in that generation of people who don't have any DB savings or have very limited defined benefit, who have a DC pension but may have had a gap before auto enrolment came in. And then there's almost an assumption, and I've seen this when we've done activity speaking to people directly. So we did a series where we interviewed people out on the streets in London and just stopped passers by and asked them questions. And a few people, they just trust that they're paying enough in for their retirement because someone has told them this is the amount that should go in there. There will be people who retire and are surprised by how little they've got, which is partly where some of the government, the campaign, the Pay Your Pension Some Attention you mentioned earlier, other things happen. There's probably going to be, though, some disparity between socio groups and people who work in, say, manual jobs versus clerical positions or other roles, because what you will likely see is that those people who might need to work for longer because their savings are insufficient are unable to do so from a health perspective. Now, at some point, that will cross over into it'll be impacted by longevity as well. But I suspect there'll be a few years where that's particularly tricky for some people. And at that point, will the state step up and do something about it? I don't.
Now, that's such an interesting thing. Yeah, and it's so hard. I mean, I can understand how tell someone that you need to save for many years in the future. It's very hypothetical, right? And also, there's all sorts of consumptions versus savings, etc. So I guess the government has a tricky balance there. And also, the government is not just telling us what to do. The goal is to, well, put in place the regulation that help, because then it's the opportunity to go back to this point, because it sounds to me, I follow this from a distance, that the government is willing to make a lot of changes. And there was this famous Mentions House speech late last year, and there seems to be a proper shake-up, at least the willingness to do a proper shake-up of the pension system. Does that inspire you? Does it seem to be going along the direction that you mentioned earlier?
In places. So yes, I think it is great that we have a government that is interested in talking about pensions, because that's not always the case and hasn't been. There's been a lot of turnover in pensions ministers. We have a new pension minister who has experience of working and understanding, given his previous role at the Resolution Foundation and the work that he did and oversaw there. He understands the challenge, right? So that's brilliant. We're not educating a new minister every 6 months around the challenges. He gets that already. But the moment the government direction and focus is, as you mentioned, around the Mansion House initiative, and in particular, they are keen on creating super funds and having those funds reach a certain threshold to be able to operate within the markets, but also invest more domestically and in private assets to create an opportunity to put that money into infrastructure, or wherever else the government thinks is important to create growth for the economy. So all of that makes sense. I guess the challenge is that it's not always aligned with what we in the industry see as the biggest issues, which is this kind of savings hole, really. But they can be tied together, and there are, the conversation is such that let's get this done first, and then we'll look at the adequacy challenge, as we call it within industry, which is a horrible term that I wouldn't want to use anywhere externally. But so I'm hopeful, I guess, is where I am.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. Now I think we've stirred really all the problems and understood what these challenges potentially are. And to be honest, I always look at pop culture when approaching this, and it seems like the only way to get people excited about pensions in films and stuff is like, oh, my pension's getting stolen, or I thought it was here and it disappeared. So perhaps being a bit alarmist is also useful. But just to go back to this point, yes, it seems to me there's a lot of wishful thinking, right? Yes, in an ideal world, the UK assets and intention will serve the UK economy by boosting the economy, the jobs, etc. We also help solve that attention, and it's all wonderful. But until last week or 2 weeks ago, we would have been better off investing in large cap US stocks and stuff like that. I don't want to show the point on that, but I want to express like all the difficulties that goes into that. And also the fact that there are many stakeholders, including the government, with a different agenda, and they're not totally imposing the agenda or their directives. It's a discussion, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and it's a very active discussion at the moment. And there are a number of industry bodies who are speaking to government, providers speaking directly. So, it is great to be having lots of conversations. So I really can't play that down enough. But it does come back to, when you think, to your point about where would your money best be invested in order to create the growth that you as an individual need to achieve so that you can get to your retirement outcome that is reasonable and adequate, is it in UK infrastructure? And it's slightly different in the DB world. It's not a non-problem because someone is taking on the risk, and it's the trust that's taking on the risk of that investment. But in the DC world, it's the individuals that are taking on that risk. So should they be taking the risk that their pot doesn't grow as much because they happen to be with a provider that's taking a stronger line on infrastructure, domestic infrastructure investment, for example, versus one that isn't, and therefore they retire with £5,000 less a year to live on? So who is carrying the responsibility for that? How do we avoid it? Right, and I think there are ways to avoid it. There's mitigations within the system that can be pulled in. So it's not that this is a huge problem that can't be resolved, but there are some challenges to get over in order for everyone to feel comfortable that this is the right thing to do with other people's money.
No, we understood, I think, very clear that it's, first of all, it's a nuanced situation. It's very complex. There's a lot of parameters. And ultimately, it's increasing an individual responsibility, but not that we can totally say it's your responsibility. And good luck. I understand how smart pension, the industry, the government, etc., are all nudging, influencing, trying to do their part. So this has been really a good way to understand where we're at. And just to think a bit more on a positive note, and I think we've touched upon it, but as you have published Delivery 2030, and you mentioned the pension nirvana, which I think we could reach in 2030, this brings me to the question that I often like to ask, which I don't call it nirvana, but I call it fantasy fintech. Like, how does it look if we don't have constraints? If people follow along, if everything comes together nicely, how does this pension system or pension proposition looks in 2030 or whatever in the near future, if it's all positively?
I think it's a really interesting question. I liked the way you posed the question and the fantasy world that might exist at some point. I mean, I remain hopeful that we get somewhere close to what we've laid out in the 2030 delivery reports in some years following that, even if it's not at 2030. But really what we would like to see is a system that works a little bit more harmoniously. It's more simple for members to understand. I'm not suggesting huge swathes of tax simplification, but just perhaps more automation so they don't need to do so much themselves. We want everyone to be able to save at a level that's adequate for them. And that's difficult to get right across the board because, as I said, lower earners, for example, may not need to save 12% in order to reach an adequate income based on their outgoings during their working life. So it's not a one-size-fits-all necessarily. I do think that there's a bit of confusion created by having two regulators operating in the market. We have the pension regulator, which oversees trust-based arrangements. The FCA oversees contract-based arrangements. So that is a complication that creates opportunity because it means you can develop something in one sphere that you can learn from and adopt into the other. But in places we see the worst of both of those things. It'd be interesting to see whether they come together, whether there's a move towards a single regulator in the future. I do think a long-term vision is important. So I would love to see a pensions and savings commission, because I don't think pensions should operate in isolation, which I'll come back to in a second. But it'd be great to work collaboratively with government to say, look, what is the nirvana? Where are we trying to get to? And how can we work together to improve that, to get to that point in a considered, sustainable way that doesn't create risk for the economy, doesn't create risk for employers, that can be paced out, so that everybody understands where we're trying to get to, and that we continue to evolve and progress over time. Because I think lots of great steps have been made. I think there's a huge amount of recognition that auto-enrollment in itself made such a big difference, has made such a big difference. But then we didn't do anything for another decade. We sat on it and said, that's great. And we didn't continue to try and progress it and improve it. And the point around wider savings, pensions is such a fundamental sphere of someone's financial life, but it's not the only thing, right? And there's things that are arguably bigger. So actually, whether you own your home or not is a bigger indication of whether you will be okay in retirement than if you have a big pension pot, because the needs to keep paying for either private rented accommodation or otherwise is a big outlay that creates a huge drain on pensions. So thinking about finances altogether, creating opportunity for products to work across different assets is something that I think we should be considering. And there's lots of bodies within the industry already talking about that, but I do think we should take it a step further. The work that PMI and Schroders have done around the long-term savings initiative is brilliant. but let's build those into that longer term plan so that we all know where we're heading and we have a good direction.
Yeah, from what you say, I mean, there's a lot here. And I'll just mention as well, because that's something we discussed with the PLSA, that they changed their name. They were a pension association, then it's Pension Lifetime Savings, because indeed, after we spoke about pension for 45 minutes, it's not just pensions. I think it's also kind of the new mindset that we have to have, because it used to be very simplistic. Oh, work and save, pension, solve. Now it's a lot more complex. I think we also probably can say on the positive side, we have a lot more freedom, if things goes well, to work differently, gradually, keep working. There's upside as well, right? Yeah. There's upside in the lifestyle that we can get. There's this Tom Cruise option that some of us might be able to take. But there's a lot going in, and you went back to this government and long-term and timetable, and also what I gather from what you said is that this nirvana, if we reach it, it's not a straight line, but it's steps to go to the nirvana. And then the other challenge is like governments only last a certain amount of years, but pension need longer. And I guess that's a bigger challenge.
Yeah, it is. But we have got over that in the past. So auto enrolment was successful because all the three main parties had a hand in that, whether it was the conceptualization of it in the first place, or whether it was the delivery through the coalition government. Actually, that made it easier for it to be delivered from concept through, even though that happened over quite a long time frame. So, and we have seen in the past pension commissions that have sat outside of core government and have advised and provided recommendations through to government. I would love to see a little bit of depoliticisation of pensions, but that's not going to happen, right? So I have to accept that. But that is really my nirvana, that there's a body that sits outside of the governing party of the day and says, right, these are the things we're going to worry about. Because I think it would make decisions like, is the state pension age now at the right place? It's probably not. I mean, we've seen the reaction in France, right, around the increase of pension age, and I'm not quite sure what the reaction would be here if it continued to progress further, but you have to balance the books on that money. Arguably, state pension age needs to move up again, but that's really difficult for a government of the day to bring in because it's bad news. It doesn't deliver any benefit for them straight away because it's in the future. But actually, if that was run outside and an advisory body said, you know what, the money doesn't work anymore, we have to change the age, that becomes an easier conversation.
Yeah, it's a very complex issue, but the previous episodes have been fairly popular. And I see that people are very interested in understanding how it works behind the scene, which is what I'm trying to do here. But I'm very grateful to Eve. And I'm sure there's more to discuss. So any suggestion on who we should talk next?
I mean, I think it would be quite a good idea to talk to James Lawrence, who's head of our investment proposition. And I think you would be able to get into some of the more detail around the investment side of what we do and how we approach that.
Absolutely, yes, because we managed to talk about it without talking about the investment side on the Investology podcast. But that was definitely a worthwhile conversation, Eve. Thank you so much. We'll, of course, put the links to find more information about you, Smart Pension. But I'm very grateful for your time and this masterclass in pension proposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much.